You are listening to AP Taylor Swift, the podcast for Swifties who are all about the lyrics. We're your hosts. I'm Jen.
I'm Muncie.
And I'm Jody.
And we are your unofficial professors of Taylor Swift.
Welcome back to another episode of AP Taylor Swift. Today we have our very first guest of the season. We sat down with DJ Louie XIV, DJ and host of the podcast Pop Pantheon. This was really such a fun conversation. Louie has an encyclopedic knowledge of pop music and pop stars. We discussed his podcast and how he ranks pop stars on Pop Pantheon. We, of course, talked about how Taylor Swift fits into the ecosystem of pop music, what sets her apart from other pop artists, and we hear his point of view on Taylor's lyrics and her evolution as an artist. But before we bring you that conversation, now that we have more than just our regular Wednesday episode drops, be sure to hit subscribe or follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, if you like what you hear, leave us a positive review. And of course, you can head to our show notes and subscribe to our Substack, where we share a weekly update on new episodes and we give you a little extra credit or behind the scenes and some research on our thoughts on this week's topic. So with that, let's get into our conversation with DJ Louie. Today, we have a very special guest joining us to talk all things pop and Taylor Swift, DJ Louie XIV. Louie is a DJ, podcaster, and writer based in Los Angeles and New York City. He hosts the hit podcast Pop Pantheon, one of the top music podcasts in the country, where he and an array of distinguished critics and media personalities overanalyze the careers of pop stars and then rank them in a system of tiers called the Pop Pantheon. In addition to his 15-plus year career as a DJ, Louie is a writer and music critic, and his work has appeared in publications such as BuzzFeed and Vanity Fair. Louie, thanks for joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here, Jody. You didn't mention my most important credential, which was co-president of our
of the
class
ninth grade. Of ninth grade,
together.
yes, correct.
Yes.
We were ninth grade co-presidents.
Yes.
I don't remember what we accomplished. Do you?
All I can imagine is that I was a slacker and you were like slaying.
You were
like,
the
it just had
personality.
to be.
You were.
I can't imagine I was doing anything productive or good at that phase of my life. Like I actually came on here to apologize publicly to you for whatever that dynamic was.
For better or for worse, I totally forgot that we were co-presidents until we got on a call a couple weeks ago, and I was like, "Oh shit, we did do that, didn't we?"
What were our responsibilities? Like, what did
I literally
we do?
have no idea. The only thing I remember is I think we like rewrote the school constitution or like the school government constitution.
So we were like the founding fathers of
of a school
for ninth grade.
Of our class of like 15
40 people. Yeah, 40 people.
Yeah, does every class get a president?
Every class got a male and female president. My favorite fun fact about the reason that there's male and female presidents for everything is because it was an all-girls school until about like 1998. Yeah. And they wanted to make sure the boys had equal opportunity to the girls. That's why there was co-president.
The common problem in this
correct.
country.
Yes.
Correct.
We're still in the struggle for gender parity.
That's a different podcast. But in addition, Louie, to being known as my ninth grade co-president, you are known for your deep dives into pop artists on Pop Pantheon. So as I mentioned, you overanalyze pop artists the way that we overanalyze Taylor's lyrics. I would love to learn more about Pop Pantheon and what is it about pop music and pop artists that lends itself to such overanalyzing?
You know, that's a great question, and it's a multifaceted answer, but the simplest thing I will say is that, well, I'll say two things. One is I think that critical discourse around pop music, the sort of like mix of the low and high sort of vibe, has always been appealing, and I think has proliferated as like the poptimism movement has risen and critical discourse took pop stars and pop music seriously and applied that kind of academic rigor to assessing something that used to be viewed as commercial fluff or something lacking in artistic value. So that's like the high-minded answer. The sort of like more basic bitch answer is I think at some point like pop stars and pop music became like fantasy football for gay people, or like
love
whenever I
it.
say stuff like that, I'm like, I don't really know what fantasy football is necessarily.
Neither do I.
Whenever I imagine fantasy, I just think that, yeah, I think that there is a like sort of fun jousting that goes on in terms of sort of discussing, especially the women in pop music. But I think for the purposes of my podcast, I think that there's both like as I mentioned, sort of just like a delight in comparing and contrasting and sort of seeing who stacks up against who in various different metrics and ways and ethereal ideas about each of them and whatever, how they all sit more broadly in our culture. But I also think that in a deeper sense, we can learn a lot about ourselves and about our culture by looking at what is the most popular and highly consumable elements of that culture. And I think pop music, because of its centrism, is sort of like an interesting window into who we are as people and what we like and what the art that we consume on the most mass level sort of like says about where we are as a culture and who we are as people. So that's my like high-minded answer to it, I guess.
I feel like you just made the case for why pop music should be studied in universities and like get a PhD
I believe
in
it
pop
should,
music.
for sure.
Yeah, in the broader landscape of pop music, and I'm sure you agree that it is quite a broad landscape, where do you see Taylor Swift fitting it in, just tying it to our podcast?
I think Taylor Swift at this moment in time exists in a league of her own, essentially. I mean, I'd say the number one trend amongst pop stars and pop music as an ecosystem over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, as the internet has taken center stage and social media has become the, central organizing principle around how we consume and share culture. Pop and pop stardom has become increasingly fractured and niche. There is a lack of monocultural saturation. It's harder and harder for pop stars to like grab hold of the zeitgeist in the way that was sort of their de rigueur practice for so long. I think when we were all kids, and I don't want to assume how old everybody in this chat is, but I'm assuming we're all around the same age. And from before that, pop stars were inherently like everywhere. They were inherently consumed by everyone, and not just people that were like actively interested in them, but
Mhm.
in a moment where everyone was listening to the radio and there was a lot more gatekeepers controlling what the mass majority of people heard. If you were thinking about someone like Michael Jackson or Madonna or Britney Spears, or even up to sort of like the Lady Gaga, Katy Perry generation of stars, that was something that dominated and saturated every corner of our existence, in some cases whether we wanted to or not. What's changed over the last 10 or 15 years is that people don't have to be beholden to these kind of classical monocultural systems for consuming this stuff. And as a result, even the biggest pop stars in the world exist in some form of silos. So like if you think about a Billie Eilish, for example, a huge pop star, probably like a generational pop star for her generation, that's
Right.
on par with Lady Gaga or Britney Spears or Michael Jackson or whoever, Mariah Carey, whoever else you want to line up. But there's a wide swath of people that have probably like never heard a Billie Eilish song, have like never, don't like maybe know who she is vaguely, but like aren't being sort of having her put in front of them, having her music put in front of them, having her work put in front of them in the way that a lot of those other generations of stars were. Taylor has completely defied that trend. She has somehow managed, and there's so many ways in which she's done that, much of which is attributable to her artistry and what her artistry is providing that is particularly appealing to this generation of consumers. Also has to do with her pretty genius business acumen, has created a monocultural force in her pop stardom that just like simply didn't seem available to most contemporary pop stars. She has defied every trend in that way. And not for nothing, in my sort of like academic study of pop star careers and trajectories, she has also defined sort of the timeline of when you peak and don't peak. I mean, I think
Interesting.
for in the traditional sort of view of pop stardom, one might have seen sort of like the 1989 era as like a traditional sort of peak for a big A-list pop star. I mean, huge album, sort of like took her fan base and expanded it, took her sound and expanded it, was successful on every level, retained what people that her initial fans loved about her, while also like growing what she was doing to a level that hadn't been seen to that point. She was quote unquote everywhere. And that was what, 6, 7, 8 years after she initially debuted, so that's like a
Right.
normal trajectory for that kind of thing to happen. And then usually pop stars, most pop stars, almost everyone, then ends up on like a slow slide towards some version of not irrelevance per se, but like they never quite get that like central stranglehold where they're setting the agenda for pop stardom like ever again. And what is kind of almost most striking about Taylor in 2023, 2024 is that she has reemerged and far surpassed that peak 18, 19, whatever years into her career. That is somewhat unprecedented. I think Michael Jackson, just because he was a child star, is maybe the only peer that she has in that particular trajectory, but it is exceedingly rare for a pop star to reach their peak of mass consumerism at this moment of their career. In fact, I would venture to say that, like, with caveats, she's the only person that's ever achieved that in the history of pop music. So she is incredibly apart from the ecosystem. Like, she is in her own echelon historically and contemporarily in a lot of ways.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the siloed nature of music today, because I think a lot of times when we get these numbers about her shattering records, people always bring up that music is so much more global, maybe in a way that it wasn't in the past today. And so therefore the numbers, of course, are bigger, and people have more access to the music because of the internet. So therefore, obviously, the numbers are going to be so much bigger. But it's true that not every artist gets to hit that magnitude just because we have streaming services. The siloed nature that you're talking about actually is kind of like the opposite. It has the opposite effect in many ways.
Absolutely. And I mean, like, the numbers she puts, I mean, you like, listen, the numbers don't lie. You put her numbers up next to anybody else, even the other sort of major A-list pop stars, and there's really no comparing anything. I think what's, sort of on the flip side intriguing about it is that even at her gargantuan size, and we were just off micing about Fortnite, there's still a way in which it's almost like she dominates the largest niche of all time or something like that, in a way. Like, there's still a world, like, we just did a series on Pop Pantheon about Michael Jackson, who I think, like, obviously commercially speaking is a peer of hers. And at the peak of Michael Jackson's career, there was not one thing he did, one song he put out, one music video he put out that not every single person on earth pretty much had some awareness of. Like, from the youngest child to the oldest person across every racial and ethnic boundary to the farthest reaches of every continent, like, people were watching the Thriller video, people were, buying that record, people were consuming the Moonwalk and all of that kind of stuff. Like, there is a way in which Taylor does hit moments that seem like they get towards that level of just like everybody knows about it and everybody sees it. But still, even in her gargantuan size, I find that to be one of the most interesting things. There's still a feeling of like, Tortured Poets Department is by far the biggest album of the year, by far the biggest album like in recent memory. And yet I still think there's a lot of even like cognizant pop culture consumers, people that like actively go after this stuff, that like could choose to avoid hearing Taylor Swift and might not have heard many songs on that album, any song on that album, so it shows she is in some ways still a part of the current moment, I guess, in that way. And yet she also is apart from it in all the ways I said. So, I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but it is an interesting
It's both
dichotomy. Yeah, it's both.
It's both. Yeah, the Eras Tour was definitely like her Thriller music video moment where you couldn't escape it, you couldn't get away from it, and yet because of, I wonder if that's because social media is so much more siloed an experience than the radio, which, to your point, had many fewer gatekeepers and there were fewer options, so more people were listening to the same thing, whereas social media, streaming services, there are so many options. So what you're actually listening to is much more niche and specific and probably localized, but those big cultural touch points like the Eras
Yes.
tour are probably what
Yes.
gives her that awareness and that visibility of her brand, but not necessarily of her
Absolutely.
specific music and her songs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no comps for her in this moment, I will say that.
Well, to be completely on brand as the former English teacher, everything you're saying too, I've always been really interested by the comparison everyone keeps making for Taylor to Shakespeare. I see it all the time. The game of like, oh, is it a
The former king of
Shakespeare?
pop, the first king of pop.
The first king of pop.
Honestly.
We totally mentioned that
do
on one
say
of our
that.
episodes in the past.
But the game of, is it a Shakespeare line or is it a Taylor Swift lyric? Which I think that game is often done to kind of push back on some of the narrative of like, oh, she only writes about her exes or all of her songs sound the same, which whatever, sexism is a whole other thing. But I have seen this comparison to be valid in that exactly everything you're saying, everyone knows Shakespeare now, of course, but back then, one of the reasons why he broke through was he was writing plays that spoke to the queen all the way down to the peasant. Like he found a way to speak to a really wide audience and there were plenty of playhouses. The Globe Theater was not the only theater, of course, but Shakespeare's enduring legacy in a lot of ways is because of the universal appeal. He was able to write for the quote unquote intellectuals, but he also had some great fart jokes that were pretty funny and they land pretty well. He just found that mass appeal. And I think that there might be something that's kind of happening here with Taylor with that as well, because something that is so unique to her is her writing and how she writes all of her own songs. And she's so intentional about that. And that's something we really focus on, obviously, the literary analysis of her lyrics. How do you view her writing as different or similar to other pop artists? And what about her writing helps her stick out to have that mass appeal, to be the moment for as long as she has been?
First of all, I love that description of Shakespeare's like career and success because I'm not an expert in that, and that actually does lend itself, I think, very, very well to what Taylor does. I think that's an incredibly astute comparison point. I want to share a phrase here that like I think might come off as like unsavory, but I don't mean it that way. I think Taylor is in some ways, I don't think this necessarily describes the totality of what she does, but I think that like a huge tenet of what she is as a writer is like a basic savant, i.e., I think that she is incredibly adept at translating really universal experiences, even as filtered through her own personal experiences, in a way that is incredibly incisive and resonant towards a lot of people's experiences. And I think that that is really what has generated the sort of like mass ability to relate to her through her songwriting, is that she seems to experience the world and have shared experiences with a lot of people. Like there's other pop stars I can think of where I'm like, your life and sort of life experience feels like really, really divorced from mine. And like maybe that's part of your appeal, is sort of your outra eccentricism. I mean, like Lady Gaga is somebody that comes to mind in this way, like where I'm not looking to Lady Gaga to like mirror my life experiences back to me directly through her songwriting. I'm looking for something else. I think with Taylor, what she is really gifted at is she seems to like approach the sort of like basic experiences of mankind, dating, rejection, boys, ambition, whatever the things are that are the core tenets of jealousy, anger, like revenge,
Career
what
chaos, yeah.
career, right, exactly, work-life balance,
Yeah,
whatever
right.
they are. And she's able to like capture experiences that feel highly relatable and obviously like get at them in a way that only somebody with her sort of incisive songwriting ability is able to do. So I think of her as a basic savant in that way. Like she is the every woman who can reflect our experiences back to us like not any other person could. So there's that kind of like bifurcation, but that like comes together to like make her a really special character in that way.
Which is really a testament to her talent, because she is not the every woman. I mean, she is a
No.
billionaire. Like none of us can relate to her life,
No.
and yet she has the ability in her lyrics to be so relatable so that
Mm.
millions of people relate to her and what she's feeling.
I think the other sort of interesting part of it is she's a masterful curator of celebrity and her own
Mhm.
celebrity presence. So on the flip side of that, the pop star is in some ways like defined, yes, by their music, but it's also their ability to create a 360-degree like version of their brand that like becomes, in Taylor's case, all consuming to the people that
Mhm.
are listening to it. So at the same time as she's sort of a master at sort of reflecting our experiences back to us in a certain way, she's also a master at telling her own story, keeping her listeners very engaged in her own story, searching her work for clues and elements of her own story. So there's the two things in tandem I think are really interesting too. Like, even if she is singing about something hyper specific, that's something that her fans are also really interested in hearing
Mhm.
from her, because you're engaged in this broader narrative that she is the sort of puppeteer behind, in some ways, the mastermind, as she would say.
Oh, yes.
You also mentioned that telling our own experiences back to us. I think one thing is that not only does she take something that maybe is super unrelatable and make it seem relatable, we've talked in the past on our podcast about how she will sometimes take things that are very ordinary, universal kind of experiences and then make them feel extraordinary, like almost fantasizing
Yes.
there, like adding a level
Yes.
of magic to them. So not only
You
do I
know,
relate to it, but now I want my life to be that way. I see it that way because I want to.
Romanticized, and
Yeah,
yeah.
romanticize.
and taking like a very small moment and like
Mhm.
milking it for all it's worth. Like, you think about Enchanted or whatever. There's like a lot of
That
songs
is,
in her
yes, that is our
discography.
Enchanted.
favorite. That is the
Like
song we
I
reference on literally every podcast. It's emblematic of her
yes.
music.
Right. And I just remember there was some point, like, my sister's also a fan of hers, and we were at some point we like sat down and we were going through the records, and I can't remember what the conversation was exactly, but we were like, how many actual experiences is she like drawing on here? Like, is she able to just come back to the same sort of things and just milk them from all these different angles and figure out different emotions? Like, I think that that's true. Like, I think she's
Mhm.
able to sort of like take a single experience and like wring 7, 8, 9 songs out of it. You know what I mean? Like, and like sort of
Absolutely.
figure out different ways to take a single glance or like a single item she imbues with me, like whatever. She can find different ways into it and like wring a lot out of like very, very small moments or little exchanges or all of that kind of stuff.
Midnight's felt that way, right? Like it was like
Yeah.
revisiting a bunch of past experiences, but here's a different take on it, or here's how it kept me up at night, or whatever. And what a cool
For sure.
concept.
I almost feel like in some ways she's an actor, in that you think about with acting, they often say, use this. When you have a real life experience, use that emotion when you're on the stage. And I think that's in some ways what we see. We talk about this all the time on the podcast of there are scenarios where, as far as we know, she never experienced it, yet the heartbreak or the love or the frustration feels so real in the song. And it feels like she has experienced those emotions, and she's so adept at tapping into that emotion for whatever scenario she's writing about, and that even if the scenario is fake, the emotion is real in every single song of hers. And I think that's part
Hmm.
of why they connect so well.
Absolutely. I think any artist could take an acting class. I think that even if you're not writing, one thing Taylor Swift has done that is a point of frustration for me with pop music in general is because her music is so hyper diaristic, I think, and she's the biggest star, she set the agenda for pop in a lot of ways to become that way.
Mhm.
And, there's ways to be real and truthful in this stuff without necessarily like approaching your work in that milieu. Like, that is
Yeah.
her strength and that's her thing. So I think the comparison to her as an actor is really apt, and I think any artist could, benefit from that kind of idea. You should be bringing, even if you're not getting on microphone or sitting down with your notepad and writing your life out in literal terms, the way you like bring your emotional life to a piece of art in an acting role is something that really I think is like universally applicable to all artists, no matter how you're expressing that. So
Yeah.
I agree. I do think she really does that, and I think she is incredibly observant about her every emotion and experience in a way that like is kind of scary to think about, like what it's like going through life as her.
Her songwriting is her therapy, and we are all experiencing it. But you said something interesting, that like it frustrates you that her diaristic songwriting has become what every pop artist is supposed to do, but it's it's also been kind of not her downfall because obviously she's doing very well, but you talked about her brand and her image and how important that is to a pop artist. Dissecting her personal life has now become part of that brand, for better or for worse. And it happens to her almost more than it happens, I think, to other artists, or at least that I've seen. I don't know. You are looking more broadly at more pop artists. Are you seeing a difference in between the way her diaristic storytelling is treated than others?
Of course. I mean, she has engendered a very
Yeah.
special, like, fixation on her own narratives
Parasocial
because
relationships
yeah,
and
and she has very effectively, but also, like, in a way that I don't think she could ever complain. Like, like Chapel Roan, ascendant pop
mhm.
girly of the moment, is out here saying, like, "Get the fuck out of my
Yeah.
business," right?
Leave me
Like,
alone. Don't
right.
talk to me that way.
Exactly, and, like, there's a huge separation between, like, who I am in this music and who I am in real life, and I don't want
Yeah.
you to call me by my real name. You know, I don't think Taylor Swift could plausibly do that necessarily because I think Taylor Swift
Yeah.
has very much invited and engendered this fixation on her life and brought those things together in a very lucrative and impactful way as an artist. But I think Taylor Swift has uniquely created an interest in her narrative because
Mhm.
she's so adept at like playing it. So other pop stars have tried this, and there's elements of this in every pop star. I mean,
Right.
you can't really be a pop star, especially now, without this sort of extra musical element to it on some level. I would struggle. I mean, it can be manifest in different ways, but I think like no one's like Bob Dylan, and it's just like let the poetry speak for itself. Like we don't. That's not how pop stardom works. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like it has to be more than that, and I think no one has displayed like a ruthless ability to like achieve that better than
Mhm.
Taylor Swift has. She is a tough fucking bitch. Like she
Oh,
can withstand a level of fame and scrutiny that like I don't even think like the average pop star could withstand. So there's elements of what she does in every pop star, but there's a level at which she like balances the whole thing and like does it all and like warps it all together and lets it all play together and somehow like seems to maintain like a level of sanity that like I don't think is normal
mm.
even for like other pop stars.
Yeah, you wouldn't survive an hour in the asylum where they raised me,
Yeah.
rings
Literally,
more and more
like
true every day.
I mean, I can't imagine what it feels like to be her. Like she can't there's like her life as I think you were mentioning like is got to be the strangest like from the
Bizarre.
inside out has got to be the strangest thing ever.
I think one thing that we have seen in more recent albums is she does actually experiment with this control over the narrative, though. Like, as you were talking, I was thinking about her folklore Evermore era where she was creating fictional characters and singing about things that were very divorced from her real life, and she was very explicit about that. Or even her Reputation era where she didn't actually give any explanation and she immediately just shut down all interviews, all media, and she was just like, I'm removing myself from this. The fact that she was even able to experiment with that, like we could discuss whether it was successful or not, but not a lot of pop stars I think even have that power to be able to do that. And I think since she's gotten to this level, she plays around with that about when do I let people into my life? When do I let them in? When do I make this album personal and when do I not?
Well, Reputation, whether or not she's doing press, is one of her most like checkers to chess. I mean, she like literally that whole album and the whole notion of it is this giant response
I
to
love it.
an attempt to grab hold of a narrative that she felt had sort of escaped from her. So I think
Sure.
that fits into sort of like her general sort of like narrative control she exerts. I agree about the Folklore and Evermore thing, and we can talk about the fact that like in some ways, if we're talking about the moment that she's in right now, this sort of like kind of almost like bewildering level of success that
Mhm.
like didn't seem plausible that she could reach another sort of bigger mountain peak. I think that the Folklore Evermore diptych was like a necessary reset.
Reset. Yeah.
And a lot of that was driven, of course, by like the aesthetic choices that she made on that record that sort of diverged from her maximalist pop aspirations on the preceding three albums. But also because I think she sort of like intentionally sort of neutralized the sort of like solipsistic or criticisms of solipsism that sort of had filtered through the culture onto her by inhabiting these other characters on those records. And that was a monumentally important pivot point that I think has set up the current moment. Like, even if those two records, which were both very successful, especially Folklore, aren't, they weren't Tortured Poets and Midnight's level sort of like mass cultural, in terms of just like pure numbers and success in that way. But or Eras Tour or whatever, but they were really important like mechanisms for like resetting the narrative on her. And I think, I don't know how much we want to get into personal conversations about like what works and doesn't work about Taylor's music for me personally.
We're here. We want to hear your point of view.
But like, that was really refreshing for me as a Taylor Swift. I don't know if I consider myself a Swiftie. I'm a very ardent Taylor Swift fan and very like like detailed observer of hers, and like I really really like a lot of her music, and I'm a fan. But so the Folklore Evermore era was very refreshing to me personally, and I've actually really struggled a lot with her sort of like pivoting back towards the more kind of like me centric music in Midnights and in Tortured Poets to some degree. Like, that music has that it's the last two Taylor Swift albums have been the first time I've ever really like stumbled in my Taylor Swift like general sort of musical fandom.
Interesting. And is it the storytelling and the songwriting, or is it because the music itself? Because it's very different for sure from Folklore Evermore.
I think where I sort of netted out is I got on the Taylor train at Fearless, which I think was like a huge entry point for a lot of people. And I think all the way through Folklore, I felt that there was like an artistic evolution that like was easy to flow with, that I sort of felt like each moment, I mean, there's no question that she's an incredibly thoughtful and like meta thinker about like how she approaches her own stardom and artistry. I always felt like we were on a forward trajectory, like in a really like measured way, as only she would do, where she just kind of grabbed her hand and like walked us through this like artistic evolution that was just like masterfully, for the most part, crafted. So every record sort of maintained the essence of the previous stuff that I had loved about her, but sort of like there felt like there was something added. They evolved, it deepened, it broadened, she tried other things. It all felt like, okay, this Taylor Swiftness can get sort of like morphed, funneled, moved in different directions. She can approach things differently. She still retains what I like about her. And, certain of those records work better and worse for me, but overall I was on the journey all the way through Folklore. When Evermore came out, it was the first time that I sort of felt like there was like an immediate redundancy that like I felt a little bit like shaky on. And when in that particular moment, I sort of chalked it up to like, she called this an album unto itself. I think if that had been marketed to me as like bonus tracks for Folklore, I would have like received it differently. And then Midnights came out, and it was the first time in my entire sort of like Taylor Swift journey where I was like, oh, so we're just like moving back. Like, we're just kind of like doubling back towards aesthetics, ideas, sounds that like we've done before. And that was really disappointing for me. To me, that is like potentially her weakest album, and I like a lot of songs on it. I mean, I think Anti-Hero is a great single. She finally rectified the like horrible lead single of her pop album. Like that's
agreed. Yes.
There's so many reasons for this. I mean, she's literally re-recording all her old albums, so like I don't know how much she's sort of like ensconced in sort of looking back at every moment of her life, and like she's currently on a career retrospective tour, and so there has been this sort of like backwards lookingness to it. So yeah, and then with Tortured Poets, which is a more interestingly kind of messy album to me, I still feel like there's sort of like an artistic stasis that is worrisome for me. I just there's some, like, again, on both projects there's things that I like about them, but I think for me personally, I'm missing that sort of like forward thrust that used to sort of like be the anchor to my Taylor Swift fandom journey, I guess.
So my question for you is, how much of that is in the lyrics and the writing? Because so we focus on lyrics, which means crediting the writers, and Jack Antonoff, frequent writing, producing collaborator for Taylor. You've
Yes.
done a couple episodes on Jack Antonoff, friend or foe.
Yes.
So
Yes.
is like, what's your point of view on Jack and his role in pop music or Taylor's music? Because as I'm listening to you talk about how much you loved the change to folklore and then going back in Midnight's
Yeah.
and Tortured Poets, very Jack Midnight's hugely Jack heavy
Yes. Yes.
album. Is it the
Yes.
Jack of it all? What's your Jack
You know,
Antonoff
I'm
POV?
hesitant to blame Jack unto himself because
Right.
Jack is out here doing lots of different
For sure.
stuff. Like you listen to Jack on Lana
He does more
albums.
than just
Well, I'm
Taylor.
just saying, like, even just aesthetically, like Jack is like actually like a pretty kind of like the reason like a lot of the girlies like working with Jack, I think, is because he kind of like lets them lead and he sort of like they set the tone as they should as like the lead artist, and he's a comforting refuge for them to share their feelings and emotions and goals and aesthetic visions, which is rare as a male producer. That's not been like the sort of historical way that like the Svengali, you know, this sort of cliche Svengali-ish male producer with the female artist
Right.
cliche of pop music has gone. So I think he has reset that paradigm, and that's made, and I think on an aesthetic level you can hear the way that he kind of gets out of the way for a lot of people.
Mhm.
Like what he does on Norman fucking Rockwell is pretty different than what he does with Taylor in a lot
Right.
of instances, or what he does on like a Midnight's version of Taylor, or what he did on Sabrina Carpenter's recent album.
Right.
Like there's a lot. I mean, it's hard to even listen to that album and like know which songs are the Jack songs
Yeah.
and which are
It's
not.
not the same.
So
It's not the
it's
same
not
as
the
listening
same.
to
So
Taylor where you're like, this is a Jack song.
yeah, which leads me to believe that like the Jack songs or the
It's
Jack aesthetic that people
mm,
are, including myself, are kind of tired of with Taylor is a as much her own direction of what she wants. I mean, and God, obviously, I
of
mean,
course, yeah,
Taylor
I was
Swift
like, of course,
is
she's
in
not
deep
doing
Yeah.
anything
yeah,
anybody tells her
exactly.
to. She's doing what
So
she wants.
yeah, so that's why I don't want to blame Jack,
Right.
but I do think she might need to push herself away from the comfort zone of Jack. And to answer your question about the lyrics, I am intrigued by like how verbose her lyrical style has become in the post folklore
Mhm.
Evermore thing. Like Taylor Swift used to be a very economical lyricist,
Yes.
even in the beauty of some of that music and some of those lyrics, no question. And an economy can be the force behind a lot of beauty in poetry and songwriting and all of that stuff. I am intrigued. Again, I find Tortured Poets, like, I guess the best thing I could say about it is that it does feel like a giant mess to me. And like, I think Taylor Swift hasn't necessarily like allowed structural mess to happen
Mhm.
in her music necessarily in the past. I mean, emotional mess for
Mm.
sure.
Yeah.
But um there's just a lot of times on the Tortured Poets songs where I'm like, this needed an editor. Like it's so there's so
Yeah.
much words. Like she used to be able to land a punch so simply, and you would just like
Succinctly, yeah.
in 6 to 8 words, all of a sudden like you got the entire story, you got her entire emotional point of view, you like saw an emotional experience like differently than you'd ever seen it before. Like those are the Taylor lyrics that like I'm just like, you're a genius. Nobody can do what you do. Like that's like, and I like, I guess, that she's trying other things. Like, and that
Mhm.
seems to be what's been the approach, like since kind of Folklore and Evermore, where it's like more words, like lots of words, but I don't favor it.
Yeah.
It's not my personal preference. If I'm going to put on Taylor music, it's not that kind of verbose. Like there's some lyric on there. I think it's on the Tortured Poet song where she talks about like getting the ring off of her finger
Yeah.
and da, da. And it's like she makes the point and then she just like keeps talking, and I'm like, no, 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 like we got it. Like you already made you already we understand what's happening here. We don't have to say the extra words. So that's my struggle, I guess, with like her current writing style.
Mhm.
And I do think they're very cozy together, the two of them. And I do wonder if somebody else would come into the mix and sort of be like, create a new dynamic, you know, create a new challenge. I don't know. I mean, I know that from my own collaborators. Yeah.
You do see that on Tortured Poets. The songs that are Taylor, Jack, and Aaron have a very
Right.
distinctly different feeling. They do feel
Right.
more succinct and edited
Right.
than the ones that are just Taylor and
Yes.
Jack. So that
Yes.
third voice really does help.
I agree. And I'm just honestly, I'm just curious. I mean, she has the talent. Like, look, Max Martin
Mhm.
in his pre-Taylor era was known as like the Svengali
Right.
male producer. You can go listen to the demo of Baby One More Time, and he sings that song exactly like she sings it. I mean, he was known for going into the studio and it's like, you're not saying baby, you're saying baby. I mean, you are
Yeah,
saying
May,
X
is it
gonna
gonna
be
be
May. I mean,
May?
like, we are going to literally say the words in this way. That was
Yeah.
his whole thing. When he started working with her and other people like The Weeknd, he had to reevaluate his style based on the values of pop music becoming more, auteurist in terms of pop
Mhm.
stars, and he had to adjust to that. But there was a way in which I remember when I first heard her collaborations with him on Red, where I was like, okay, like she got in there with the biggest heavyweight in pop music, somebody we have heard produce music for every single person on the planet Earth, and she has still retained her force of personality and perspective and point of view on these records. Like, that is not easy. That is a testament to what she can do with even like the most forceful person in the room with her. And no question, what he does elevated, and they worked amazingly together, and I love also what he brought to her. But I'm saying, like, that just makes me wonder, like, what would be the synergy and magic of, like, there's so many interesting producers that she could be working with right now. She's got a blank check. She can do whatever she wants. There is nobody on this earth that she can't call up. There's nobody that wouldn't want to work with her. So I guess there's also a frustration in that for me, where I'm kind of like, you have nothing to prove. There's no reason that you shouldn't be
Yeah.
trying new shit, in my opinion. That's how I feel about the current
Well,
mode of
she
Taylor
keeps
Swift.
pushing the peak, so maybe the best is
Yeah,
yet to come. Who knows?
could be. Could be. I wouldn't put anything past her.
Along those lines, actually, I'm glad that we touched a little bit on the evolution of her music. Pop music, at least to my naive understanding of it, is often criticized for being formulaic. Do you see it that way? And if you do, how do artists like Taylor Swift, in your opinion, break free from that or even evolve it over time? Because pop music it evolves as a genre over time. How does one push it kind of forward while sticking to some basic formula that makes it what it is?
So I think, like, ideally, and like this is, there's so many variations and answers to this question, and every artist approaches it differently. I think ideally with pop music, it's the combination of familiarity and excitement that is what drives good pop music. Like, pop music inherently is familiar, like it's drawing on structures and ideas and accessibility that is what makes it appealing to broad swaths of people. So it's inherent to pop music that there is a formula, that there is a standard. And Taylor Swift is an astute student of those structures. I mean, she is a songwriting virtuoso, and we think of her that way, not because she is Fiona Apple, like spewing, poetry and like upending song structure and, sending us in directions that we couldn't predict and don't know where to. I mean, most Taylor Swift music fits very soundly into a traditional song structure that is part of her
Right.
strength. And I think pop music ideally is giving you that, and then giving you something that kind of makes you go like, wait, that's
Mhm.
weird, that's different, that's new. And I think Taylor has done her version of that in a lot of her work. I don't think people come to Taylor Swift for sonic innovation in the broader sense of pop music.
Right.
Like, I think people want her to innovate within her own milieu and to try
Mhm.
and to evolve within her own standards. But Taylor Swift's gift, as you all, deal with on your show and is like clear to everybody, is her songwriting, her incisive ability to like get at emotional resonance. Like, that is why people come to Taylor Swift. Like, everything is secondary. Everything with Taylor Swift is and should be secondary to that at all times. Even in her most maximalist pop work, that's how it functions for me. So I don't think there's other artists where people are like, if you're going to Charlie XCX partially because you're looking
Yeah.
for somebody that's going to like push the envelope. You're
Mhm.
going to whoever, Kate Bush in her time. You're going to other people for that. I think Taylor knows where she fits in with pop, which is that
Yeah.
she knows what her strengths are. She knows what a pop star is supposed to do in a meta sense of the word. And she's been able to kind of like fuse those two things together in a way that makes sense for her. Taylor Swift is a pop songwriter. She exists in the tradition of pop stars and pop songwriting, both like in terms of like the way that works aesthetically, the way that's worked historically. She's Carole King, she's Joni Mitchell, she's Michael Jackson, she's Madonna, she's all of those things. They're all in the mix there. So I think that Taylor Swift has had a very, 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 not to no one's surprise, smart and self-aware knowledge of like what works for her as a pop songwriter and pop musician. I guess my answer to your question is she knows what is demanded of her and she plays the game extremely well. And I think maybe part of like the forward-looking thing for her is maybe it is shaking off some of the shackles of the I don't know what, like, again, I think that's something that she sort of began to get at a little bit with her writing styles on Tortured Poets. She could go full left field. She could try to make like a Fiona Apple type album. I don't know what she has there's a lot of possibilities for her, but I think that she has very smartly played to her strengths, and she knows kind of like what makes her unique, and then also how to like funnel what makes her unique into this sort of like solid knowable structures of pop music. So that's her version of sort of like the familiar and the singular,
it's like sticking to the formula but adding a little bit of the unique personality.
Yeah, like
brand.
Exactly. Like, you know when you hear a pop song that sounds like it was written by AI, like Taylor Swift songs do not sound like that.
It's so interesting hearing you talk because I know nothing about music. I have never claimed to know anything about music. It's a common thing here, but I know literature. And I've been developing a theory for a while that, so, we think about Red as her transition album in some ways from, country to pop. I think in the Tortured Poets album, I think she in some way stopped playing with some of the formulas of pop music and she started playing with the formulas of literature. It feels like a transition into a much more, one, branded literature. It's branded as a literary thing. But that was something I was wrestling with when the album first came out because there were so many elements to it. One, she plays with a lot of tropes. It's that I've gone through that we talk about how messy the album is. The album, almost every song positions herself as a completely different character. Is she the golden girl who's going to change the bad boy good? Is she been abandoned? Is she lost? Is she a forlorn love? Is she the other woman? All of those, every song positions her as something else, and then it ends with the manuscript saying, I don't know. And that's, the common core challenge of being an adult human, especially in your 30s, of, I'm starting to realize that there's actually not a clean way to define what I am as a person. It's actually really messy. But some of the stuff you were saying of, repetitive, of going back over things, a lot of those are really obvious literary devices to say, hey, I want you, the reader, to know what it's like to obsess over your ex. So I'm going to actually obsess over it in a literary way so you get that experience. So I've been developing a theory of, I don't know what's next for her, but this Tortured Poets to me felt like a transition where she wanted to start playing with new types of writing outside of the world of music, and then she set it to music.
I was thinking something similar when you were talking about the conciseness, because before you could have one line that just delivered a punch, got right to it. This was the first album where I feel like pretty much everyone agrees that the more and more and more you listen to it, you kind of went on a journey where like you started off hating it and then you slowly got very excited and then you started off sad and then you slowly ended up very triumphant. And that's just not a normal thing that she used to do. So it's a good point. I hadn't thought about it literarily, but it's a good point to think of it that way as a transition.
I also love the comparison to Red because Red was also criticized for being a messy, incoherent album. The criticism was that there were too many different genres. It wasn't cohesive enough. And that's similar to what we're saying about the Tortured Poets department, was it's just too much. To your point, this could also be a transition album. You only knew that Red was truly her transition album when 1989 came out, so it remains to be seen what is next, and then maybe Tortured Poets will be put into clearer context.
It's karma.
But Red has the bangers.
I love Red.
Banger ratio on
I know,
Red.
it's so good.
True.
Like, come on. It might be messy, but like
it's epic.
the hit rate is undeniable.
But there are some duds. There are some Starlight.
The secret of Red is that the back half of Red is.
Yeah. How dare
like,
you get down on Starlight?
I'm so sorry.
I will fight you.
No, but like it is true. It is true that like Red has this kind of like house log glow because we like look back, but like
we look back on it that way.
Yes, but the first half of Red
is
like,
epic.
There's singers. That's like 8 of her best songs.
State of Grace, like Treacherous. It is, but it also started with We Are Never Getting It Back Together, which was not. So
incredible. Sorry, that's so wrong. Insane take.
That's also my husband's
I'm leaving
favorite
the chat.
The
Hot
loyal
takes.
fans have
Hot
have
take
their
all
way.
around.
That is a crazy take.
Hot takes.
Perfect song.
Perfect.
No
notes. No notes. Louis, you just mentioned Taylor in the context of a lot of pop superstars, yet you haven't officially ranked Taylor in your pop pantheon. A, why? B, what criteria are you using to ranking these artists? And like, how do you know when to when is I kind of want to know when is Taylor's time, but also just generally.
Yeah, you and everyone else.
I know, right? I'm like, you're like, I have a plan, just like Taylor does.
I mean, literally, yes. It is the most requested, desired thing, and so I plan to keep this podcast going as long as I can.
Right? You're like, when I'm ready to retire,
Also,
then I'll do it.
How many episodes can that series be?
Oh my god! Yeah, well, your MJ one
is it
was
20 episodes?
Yeah.
I mean, what do we do?
Well, we're on 60 episodes of our podcast, so if that's any indication.
Yeah,
I like the idea that this is a slow burn romance, but it's just you pushing off this person on your podcast as long as possible.
It's literally that. It's like once we do that, there's nowhere to go.
Does he not like Taylor? Is that why he hasn't ranked her?
No, it's really not that. The answer to your other question is, so the Pantheon has like 6 tiers in it. I won't bore you with all the details, but in terms of Taylor, the top of the pop pantheon, tier 1 is like the most rarefied, and like we put out an episode today that was sort of like revisiting, explaining all the different tiers of the pantheon, and the number one thing I can say about tier 1, aside from all the like nuances and sort of like little requirements that we have like sort of gleaned are the entry points here. If you were going to put the 20 most impactful and important pop stars in a tier, that's what tier 1 is. Like of all, and I'm talking like across the history of recorded music, you get 20 slots, maybe even 15. Yeah, it was so that's how we think about that top tier. So the question will be for Taylor Swift when we get to her, like, has she risen to that level?
Right.
Like,
is she one of 20?
If you were only going to name 15 or 20, and I'm talking like Frank Sinatra's up in there, like Elvis is up in there, like everybody, every of the ones that we all think of. And like, there's a lot of people, and like, let me tell you, my inbox and my DMs will speak volumes to this. People get very upset about other huge pop stars that have not made it up there too. So
it's a risky proposition trying to rank pop stars. Like, you open yourself up to a lot of feedback.
You're telling me. But yes, I think that's the question that looms over the Taylor Swift conversation, and I think there's a pretty solid argument that she has perhaps ascended to that place. But I certainly will not be showing my hand here.
No,
as much as I respect and love you all.
Fair.
Fine.
But those episodes, they are certainly coming. Never fear.
In 5 years, when you are ready.
No, not that long.
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us. We have one more question, so I'm just going to thank you before I ask that question. This has been a blast. But what we are asking all of our guests is, so in our first episode of AP Taylor Swift, all 3 of us answered the question of what was the song that first made us a Swiftie? Very specifically, though, what was the first song we heard that we were like, oh my goodness, like, she's onto something, she's going to be big, I am a fan of this person. So that's our question for you. What was the first Taylor song you heard and you were like, oh dang, she's onto something, she's going to be big?
It's cliche, but it's Love Story, which I still think, probably is, still stands to me as one of her like 5 or 10 greatest songs. I mean, that was my gateway to Fearless, which like I think has like a number of songs that made me feel what you're asking me about right now. But Love Story was the song where I first heard it and I was like, oh, this is like moving me to tears and elation, and like, who is this like fucking teenage girl that's doing this to me? And I'm like I'm like a guy in college, like, and I'm like, oh my god, she has like captivated my mind, my heartstrings, everything. So that's my
right from the
honest
beginning, you
answer.
knew.
Yeah.
And then wait, what album is which is your favorite album?
I
know I hate asking this question. I hate answering this question.
I have the answer. I mean, it's probably Red, but it's also Reputation. I'm
Reputation girlies unite.
I mean, I think Reputation was undone by a horrible lead single
Correct.
and a the
lack
narrative,
of marketing, because we're
lack
all
of marketing,
we're
and
all marketing people.
Also the way that it's thought about and remembered and was sold at the time, which is like, I'm responding to Kim and Kanye, which is not what the album
Yes.
really is.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
it's I love that album because it's one of the only times that she like really made concessions towards like other centrist pop aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very interesting to hear Taylor Swift like doing that and sort of like inserting herself into all of these sort of like noticeable like contemporary sounds that like other artists were doing at the time, and still sort of like being her and like providing like as a showcase for just like how forceful what she does is, that it can exist and survive in those modes, is really interesting to me. I think it's one of her most like consistent records. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
one of her most like the mood of it is very consistent to me. I think, yeah, a number of my favorite Taylor Swift songs are on there, and I will I'm in the trenches for Reputation for the rest
Taylor's
of my life.
version that we've been saying
That's not going
for
to
a
be good.
full
If
year.
she can't, because she and Max are on the ropes, right? Like, because I think the sort of the scuttlebutt is that she wouldn't clear her songs for his musical. So
is that why we're not getting it?
So he hasn't participated in any of the re-recordings of his songs, where like they've been recreated by other people. And I actually, this is a topic for another podcast, but I think it's harder in some ways to recreate synthetic production than it is to recreate some of like the simpler productions of her earlier work. And I happen to find that like the Max Martin recreations on 1989, for instance, like are noticeably different.
Right.
So
they sound very
I'm
different.
concerned about like the maximalist Max Martin productions on Reputation. Like,
I wonder if that's why we're stalling. Like, what if she's trying to mend things?
It could be. It could be.
But it's also created such anticipation for this album that that would backfire, because we are now waiting with bated breath for this album that if it doesn't sound as good or better than the original, we're going to be pissed.
I'm imagining her like delivering flowers to his door every day.
Yeah, she needs to go to Pacific Palisades and knock on the door and ask for forgiveness. I'm telling you, just for this one record, like it's really a problem. I mean, the first one's going to be interesting too, because like she just sounds so different, and like she doesn't sing in the fake country accent. I mean, that's
I'm so excited for debut. I'm excited for her improved vocals, her lack of a fake twang, but all those songs that spoke to me, like 15-year-old Jennifer will come alive, and I'm excited for it.
I mean, Teardrops on My Guitar are these are some of still the best Taylor Swift songs to me.
Well, anyway, if you love Love Story, you should make sure you listen to our deep dive of Love Story, where Monzi and I argue very well that it's actually about a pregnancy, and we broke Jody's spirit.
I died.
She's still upset about it.
In the bathtub right now.
Went off the rails, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it.
It actually kind of works.
You're not stretching credulity in my mind. I don't think you'll have a hard time convincing me.
It broke my brain. That and the Archer episodes are the ones that I'm like, I can't listen to those.
Okay, I have to listen to those.
Yeah, no. Well, gosh. Louie, thank you for joining us and spending some time with us today. It was really fun, and we cannot wait for when you finally rank Taylor on Pop Pantheon.
Likewise. I can't wait for either. Thank you so much for having me. I had such a fun time. It was great talking to you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you today on AP Taylor Swift. Be sure to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. Follow us on your social channel of choice at AP Taylor Swift to stay up to date. And join us next time as we overanalyze and deep dive into the next Taylor Swift song on AP Taylor Swift.